pointed out what a patriot is. Now, you can be a patriot in your natural sense, but there's also a sense of being a patriot spiritually for the people of God. So he shows his patriotism. Okay, here's the setup. Israel pursued the Philistine route from Michmash to Ajalon, where that's the valley where the sun and the moon stood still. That's 20 miles away. That's 20 miles of not plains, but mountainous terrain. 20 miles of mountainous terrain, 20 miles of warfare during that mountainous terrain. That would be exhausting in and of itself. But now the king adds an extra burden on the soldiers. Verse 24. And the men of Israel were distressed that day. He had no vision. Were distressed that day, for Saul had adjured the people, saying, Cursed be the man that eateth any food until evening, that I may be avenged upon mine enemies. So none of the people tasted any food. Saul's reasons for this oath is purely selfish. I may be avenged upon my enemies. And note here, when your motives are selfish, you have no authority in the Lord to be doing it. Amen. He had no divine authority to put this upon the men. He was the king, and he was acting of his own self-interest and not under the directives of the Lord. I want to read a quote of the study of 1 Samuel from Bob Deffingbaugh. It seems that Saul's image suffered greatly ever since his impressive defeat of the Ammonites at Jabesh Gilead in chapter 11. Saul has been humiliated by the Philistines not only by their occupation of Israel, but by the way they capitalize on Iron Age technology. Much of Saul's embarrassment is the direct result of Jonathan's initiative, that bratted son of his, in attacking the Philistines. Now that he sees the Philistines suffering defeat at the hand of the Israelites, Saul is determined to make them pay for his humiliation. His fight with the Philistines has become personal. It is not God's battle, Israel's battle. It is his battle and his victory. All right, that provides a little bit more context there. Verse 25. And all they of the land came to the wood, and there was honey upon the ground. Honey upon the ground. That sounds like manna to me. God's supernatural provision, right where they needed it. God's version of fast food. They didn't have to stop and kill a cow. They didn't have to go through all that stuff. They didn't have to light a fire. It was God's version of fast food. Actually, the best food for the energy for a battle, that sugar rush that they would need. That was the best food for them. God was supernaturally just happened to be right there, flowing for them. Verse 26. And when the people were come into the wood, behold, the honey dropped. You can imagine how luscious and beautiful that looked to a starving, hungry man. But no man put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. What was keeping them from God's divine provision? Man's legalism. This oath was not from God. He didn't direct Saul to do this. This was exclusively Saul's idea. So it was the shackles of man, his superficially looking, religious sounding order, was blocking God's soldiers from God's abundant provision and nourishment. God's laws are not impractical or grievous. How many sincere Christians are sitting under the teaching that the Lord doesn't heal, He doesn't do the miraculous, He won't give you a heavenly language. All of that is just for special people back then, at a certain time. That's telling people, no, that honey isn't for you. Don't eat it. You're cursed. You'll be filled with the devil. That isn't for you. Lord, don't look at the Lord's promises. That's not for you. Oh, but by the way, you must not under any circumstances dance or make up, go to movies. Mm-hmm. That's man versus God. You just have to have the view of you just determined to know nothing except Christ and Him crucified. Okay, verse 27. But Jonathan heard not when his father charged the people with the oath. I am so thankful I was raised outside of all that people regard. Then you can see it for what it is from the outside. Wherefore he put the end of the rod that was in his hand. Well, wherefore, that means that if he had known, he would have been obedient to this, just because it was the word of the king, he would have been obedient. Okay. Wherefore he put the end of the rod that was in his hand and dipped it into a honeycomb and put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes were enlightened. And one of the people then answered one of the people and said, My father straitly charged the people with an oath, saying, Cursed be the man that eateth any food this day. And the people were very faint. Then said Jonathan, My father hath troubled the land. He meant legalism. How did he meet this legalism? With the truth. He spoke it in love. It was his father. He didn't say, oh, my dad's a blah, 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 blah. He spoke it in love, but he spoke the truth.
Yes, he did.
He spoke the truth. Yes. My father hath troubled the land meaning people, the people. That's an interesting word choice when he describes his father's foolishness, troubled. That shows a great amount, that word choice shows a great amount of Jonathan's spiritual discernment, and also, just in a natural sense. We already know he follows the Spirit of the Lord. He describes it as troubling. It references Joshua's defeat at Ai, where Joshua also uses that word troubling. It's the exact same Hebrew word. It says, when Achan sinned in taking the accursed thing, it says, Why hast thou troubled us? The Lord will trouble you this day. It's the Hebrew word akar. It means to roil the water, disturb or afflict it. When Achan troubled Israel, he brought about Israel's defeat and the death of many warriors that day. And that ended up being the verdict. At the end of the day, because of Saul's ridiculousness, they ended up with a much lesser, they won, but it was a much lesser victory than they could have had. The people were provoked to sin. And Jonathan broke the civil law, which he never would have done. It said right there, he didn't know. He never would have broke that civil law of his father. The people were provoked to eat the blood with the flesh. That was indeed the cause. He was troubling Israel. Verse 29. See, I pray you, how mine eyes have been enlightened, because I have tasted a little of this honey. How pathetic. What poor leadership. Even in the natural, driving your men to where just a taste of honey would be refreshing. That doesn't even make sense in the natural. Man's laws always hinder. Spiritually, the natural, man's laws always hinder. So we see here the character trait where number 11, Jonathan is showing his heart for what? The success of God's people. His patriotism for the success of God's people. He's moving on. How much more? If haply the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies which they found, for had there not been now a much greater slaughter among the Philistines? His ire is raised here just a little bit, but it's not for his own welfare. He didn't even respond to the deal that his father was speaking a curse over his head. He didn't even respond to that. No, what he was impassioned about, what his reaction was concerning the mission's success.
Yes.
His eyes were steadfastly still on that goal, which was not just to skirmish with it. No, he wanted the utter defeat of the enemy. His heart was to build up and supply God's people, which the Lord was providing for them, and give his troops the necessary tools to win. Isn't that a timely message? Give the troops what they need to win. to win. So Jonathan's concern was clearly not with his own life. He was fighting for the freedom from the ungodly, to end the oppression of God's people. He was fighting the enemies of God. His concern was for the nation, for God's people, the land of Israel.
Yes. Yes.
Versus Saul, who was sitting back on tearing under that tree, making civil laws in pride and vanity that did nothing but limit, hinder, and weaken them spiritually and naturally, and keep them back for the fullness of victory that God obviously wanted for them. So again, which one has the heart of a king here? Alright, so there's the sixth glimpse. Let's move on to our final glimpse of Jonathan before the introduction of David. The seventh glimpse of Jonathan, we find him as a archetype of altruism. altruism. If you're not familiar with that word, we'll get around to it later. It's amazing. Establishes himself in my mind as one of the most altruistic people in the history of mankind. Saul's oath provoked the people to sin, eating the flesh of the blood. And then they went back and offered the sacrifices to obtain the Lord's pardon. So one of the circumstances of this seventh glimpse that we get of Jonathan, in jump to verse 36. And Saul said, "Let us go down after the Philistines by night and spoil them until the morning light, and let us not leave a man of them." Oh, now he's ready to go. Now that the Philistines are already on the run, he's in the mood to raid, pillage, and plunder all night.
Right.
Yeah, now, okay. And they said, "Do whatsoever seemeth good unto thee." And then said the priest, Wait. Let us draw near to God. And Saul asked counsel of God. And this asked counsel in the Hebrew is using a technical term for inquiry, using the Urim and Thummim. 37. "Shall I go down after the Philistines? Wilt thou deliver them into the hand of Israel?" But he answered him not that day. Remember, it's getting close to evening. If they'd waited a few hours, it would have been technically the next day. And the Lord didn't say no. He just didn't answer him that day. So why didn't the Lord answer him? Well, technically, it could have been sin, but of course he never looked at himself. But here are some good choices. No one knows exactly why, but here are some really, really good options. Saul was being mighty presumptuous to begin with, just to snap his fingers and say, "Instead the Lord to jump right then."
That's right.
That's mighty presumptuous. Could have been a direct chastisement on Saul for his sin. Recall the last two meetings he had with the Lord? Instead of waiting for the prophet, he went and offered the sacrifice himself. And then after that, when he was trying to discern whether or not God would actually work through Jonathan that way, he gets halfway through an inquiry with the Lord. He's like, no, wait, we're going to go out anyway.
Yeah, right.
Cut it short, and God could have been like, "You're not interested in it my way, we'll just let you sit on it for a little bit. Go sit in a corner." Could have been a direct chastisement upon Saul for his sin. And he had also, through this foolish, sinful oath that he had made, been the main reason for the provoking of the people to sin. So there's one. And then another one is Saul's motive, as we see here, is purely selfish and vindictive. Remember, they're still his enemies. And God probably did, once he's in charge of this assault again, didn't want to bless or sanction Saul's vindictive, selfish attitude and motivation behind this attack. And then another really good reason is that the army had just defiled themselves with blood. The sacrifices had been offered, but according to Levitical law, you offer the sacrifices, and then you remain what? Unclean unto the even. So it's logical that the Lord was just saying, just wait, chill, wait for a little bit for your own good, till sundown, till this current judgment is over, keeping them back from going off when they were still unclean before the Lord. wait till you're clean in God's sight. It's very plausible that he would have let them go then, waited just a few more hours. It just says he didn't answer them that day. So those are several really good reasons why the Lord didn't answer Saul. Besides his presumption that it was somebody else's sin. Okay, verse 38. And Saul said, "Draw near hither," gather round, "all the chief people, and know and see wherein this sin hath been this day." Well, la-ti-da. Well, the word translated here as sin is Hebrew word chatta, emphasis ah. And this word sin is specifically regarding the punishment of the sin, the offense and its penalty. It is distinct from the Hebrew word chatta, which means the actual sinning or the going wrong, the actual sin itself. But what this word here, wherein a sin has been committed, he is calling it somebody's sin, but he's referring to the sin of somebody broke my oath, and that's the reason why God isn't answering me. Okay. So, what he's saying, who broke God's law, causing him not to answer me? What he's saying is, that's what he's thinking, but what he's saying out loud is, who broke God's law? Who sinned? Who broke God's law, causing him not to answer us? There's a splitting hairs there, but it's not splitting hairs. Okay, sin. What he's equating violation of God's law and trying to equate violation of his law. That law which he made that he had no divine authority to make, he's equating violation of his law, his civil law, with the violation of God's law. Okay, that's quite something. That's quite something to equate. Okay, verse 39. That's what he is doing now. Verse 39. For as the Lord liveth, which saveth Israel, though it be in Jonathan my son, he shall surely die. He just keeps digging a hole deeper, compounding one oath upon another. The punishment was originally a curse. So now he's pronouncing death on top of it. He's raising the consequence. Why? This begs the question, why? Would he, number one, single out his son out of all the men that was with him? And why would he single him out when he's just compounded the punishment with execution? Verse 39b. And there was not a man among the people that answered him. Well, everyone's answering the question directly asked. Who sinned? Who broke God's law, causing him not to answer? The answer to that is nobody. The sin of the people had already been atoned for. They used that charge card of the Old Testament sacrifices and got it all taken care of. All right. So verse 40, he's like, well, nobody's answered him. So then he said unto all Israel, be ye on one side, and I and Jonathan my son will be on the other. And the people said unto Saul, do what seemeth good unto thee. Now this particular division of the way he divided up how the lots were to be cast is quite irregular with how lots are supposed to be cast. It's mostly done by tribe, etc. Not the way Saul was doing it. So with this irregularity in mind and Saul's obvious propensity to jealousy, even toward his own son, I'm persuaded to agree with a lot of the scholars that hypothesize that somehow Saul already knew about the honey. Possibly that one man told him, I don't know, maybe he overheard something, who knows. But that would answer that begging question why Saul would retroactively go back and elevate punishment to execution.
Right.